Significance of Race, which was published in 1978, and second edition came out in 1980. And by the declining significance of race, I didn't mean that racism was less important. What I meant was that economic class position in the black community had become more important than race in determining black life chances. Prior to, say, 1970, it didn't matter a great deal whether you were wealthy or poor black. The chances of you passing on your success to your children were rather slim because race trumped everything else. Then beginning in the mid-60s, early 70s, class began to operate in the black community in terms of the accumulation of success that you're able to pass on to your children, the way it has always operated in the white community. And that's when I began writing this book, The Declining Significance of Race, emphasizing that economic class position had become more important than race in determining black life chances. And at that time, that was a very controversial thesis. And everybody was upset with me except black trade unionists, people like A. Philip Randolph and so on, came to my rescue. But the middle class blacks, they were very upset, saying things like, why is he focusing on the black poor? All blacks suffer, And a lot of people felt that my arguments would undermine support for affirmative action programs. But what I was trying to do was to get people to recognize that a lot of affirmative action programs do not address the needs of what I call the truly disadvantaged. I'm a strong supporter of affirmative action, but if you really want to address the problems of the disadvantaged, you've got to move to things like full employment. Like, for example, I talked about, at the time I was writing this book, there was very little discussion in the black community about the Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill. Most of the discussion was on the Alan Bakke affirmative action case. Only the black trade unionists were talking about the need for full employment, Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill. And I remember I was meeting with a group of black leaders, and Coretta Scott King and Jesse Jackson and a number of people, and I raised this issue. Why isn't the black community rallying behind John Conyers and other black members pushing the Humphrey Hawkins full employment bill, you see? Because it didn't really sort of address the things that they were concerned about at that time. Alan Bakke, affirmative action, seemed to be much more important. So I was quite a controversial figure back then, but now it's conventional wisdom. No one questions the idea that there's a growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in the black community, with the black middle class moving ahead and the black poor falling further behind. Now, the black middle class is experiencing problems during the economic recovery because many of them are not in the same secure middle class positions that comparable whites are. But nonetheless, there has been a substantial increase in the black professional class. I think it's been quite impressive. But at the same time, there's a group of blacks who are experiencing greater joblessness, and before we had the welfare reform bill, greater involvement in welfare, higher rates of and all the problems associated with joblessness and
crime, incarceration.
Right, crime, incarceration, so on. Right.
The late James Farmer of the Congress of Racial Equality and later the co-founder of the Fund for an Open Society used to say that what we need is a domestic Marshall Plan model, like the plan in Europe after World War II, in which we saturate communities with resources.
That's what the Harlem Children's Zone is doing. You're exactly right. Saturating community with resources so that these communities resemble more stable, not necessarily middle class, but more stable working class neighborhoods.
Do you think there's a political will to do that?
No.
No.
Mm-mm. No, that's going to be a hard sell. On the other hand, I think that the Harlem Children's Zone would not be a hard sell. That turns out to be a race-specific program in the sense that it's addressing the needs of a disadvantaged population in a black community. But it would be a much easier sell because you could talk about the incredible results. And if you describe it, if you frame it in a way that is consistent with American values. You know, the public opinion polls show consistently that Americans believe in a level playing field. Yeah. And Americans will support programs that allow people to help themselves. For example, whereas Americans are overwhelmingly against preferences, quotas, and numerical guidelines, they overwhelmingly support programs, for example, that would provide scholarships to black kids who have good grades in school. And they overwhelmingly support training programs so people can improve their chances in the labor market.
Are you optimistic that, if not in your lifetime, in the lifetime of some of the students here, that you will see this income divide in the black community be ameliorated, that the young black men and the young black women who don't have the skills will somehow be educated through such programs to gain these skills so that, 20 years from now we can say, we have what you're talking about here, this good working class solid base?
Well, there will always be, a class structure. Some in the black community, just as we have a class structure of more wealthy people, middle class people, poor people, working class people, poor people, in the white community. That's going to happen. That's something that we won't change in my lifetime. However, what I would like to see is elevating the floor. Yeah. Right now, the black poor is so far behind the rest of society that it's depressing. I want to sort of elevate the floor and move the black poor closer to where the white poor and
But you say we have no political will to do that.
Not unless you frame it in a way that it's just difficult to frame it so that you can get people excited about something like this. And that's why I kind of sort of rely on some universal programs that benefit all groups. I would think that there are certain universal programs that would benefit the black poor more than the other poor, but they could be defined as programs that are available to all groups. Now, that was a position that I took very strongly years ago. I now feel that you need a combination of the universal programs and the sort of race-specific programs. And the Harlem Children's Zone could be construed as a race-specific program. But if you're going to have these race-specific programs, you have to be very, very careful about how they are framed. And you want to frame them in a way that the framing captures or is consistent with what the American people feel ought to be.
If you have questions, we'd like to invite you to come down to one of the two mic positions and come right down, so we'll get you on mic and you'll be heard. And we'll ask you to keep any statements very brief and get quickly to the question because we have only a certain amount of time. We have much more to say in the conversation, but we'd like your input for sure. And just step right up and Professor Wilson will answer your question. Yes?
My question is, in your studies and your research, do you see...
Is that mic on? Can you hear him?
We can repeat the question if you can't hear, but
okay, go ahead.
Okay. My question is, in your studies and your research, do you see any evidence of people and institutions fighting to inhibit the type of progress that you see in these movements like the Harlem Children's Zone?
Well, let me just say this, that when Obama announces the promised neighborhoods, which are patterned after the Harlem Children's Zone, I can predict the typical reaction from Republican right-wingers and Rush Limbaugh and that crowd. They're going to come out big time against it. And that's to be expected, to be naive to assume that everyone's going to accept this. There's going to be a